Hello everybody and welcome to the live stream for tonight, starting a little bit earlier than usual that is, because I am wanting to offer some comment on this Nigel Farage story that's been floating around and its relevance to the usual things that we talk about here. And so I'm just going to be dropping the link to the live stream in the Telegram. So make sure everybody there knows that we're on. So yes, I wanted to start a little bit early because there's been the news over the past couple of days that a couple of prominent people, one very prominent, one prominent mainly on Twitter, have had their bank accounts cancelled. And this is, of course, relevant to they are our very subject under discussion, which is, of course, the control exercised by the state and the ruling class over our everyday lives. And this is a very high-profile example of this. Now, the two people I'm referring to are, of course, British. And this is the guy that runs the Wings Over Scotland Twitter account. He's a Scottish nationalist who was a big-time supporter of the SNP, then turned against the SNP. Now, he had his account cancelled with no reason offered. According to him, he wasn't going drastically over the overdraft limit or anything like that, or any of the usual things that they would have as justification for cancelling your account outright. And the other one, who is much higher profile, is of course Nigel Farage, former leader of the United Kingdom Independence Party, very heavily associated with Brexit, and a man who has been, whether he meant to be or not, something of a thorn in the side of the political establishment. I don't think he ever really meant to be, but he ended up becoming one. And this, of course, has been jumped on by a number of people who are talking about the fact that this is central bank digital currencies next, total control, etc. I need to point out, first of all, that they've always had the power to do this, to withdraw banking services from you. As soon as everybody was starting to use bank accounts in this country, and indeed any advanced capitalist country, they had the power to kick you out of them again. They've used this specifically against the trade unions in the past. In the 84 to 85 miners' strike, banking services were withdrawn from the National Union of Mine Workers. And so the NUM under Scargill had to, in that strike, basically run their entire operation on cash, which is a little bit more difficult these days, given how much of everything is becoming purely digitized. But just to emphasize, this is something that the state has always been able to do to you if they want to fuck with you, basically. And the digitization of everything has just made this process a little bit easier for them. And so with the Wings Over Scotland guy, clearly he's a target because, might be that he's associated with the Scottish independence campaign, might be that he's said other things that have got under the skin of people in high places. But with Farage, it's particularly interesting because he's been a pretty high profile politician for almost 25 years, maybe longer now. I remember him being on TV when I was a teenager back in the late 1990s. And he's very much associated with Brexit. He is, or indeed has been, instrumental in Brexit happening because it was his ability to build up the power of this right-wing alternative to the Conservative Party, UKIP, that pressured David Cameron into offering the referendum and holding it, as Cameron believed that his party was going to fall apart before the 2015 election without offering that concession to the anti-EU wing. And ultimately, then we got the fatal run of events that, from the capitalist class's point of view, ended up with the disaster for them of Brexit. Now, Nigel Farage is by no means in any way anti-capitalist. He's very enthusiastic about capitalism. The reason why Nigel Farage found himself in opposition to the ruling class and the political class and media class in this country, or at least the sections of it that are overwhelmingly pro-EU, because the ruling class is overwhelmingly pro-EU, is because he was and is a man who clings to an outdated vision of what British capitalism is. Nigel Farage and those who admire him, those who go along with him, have one thing in common often, which is that they are people who don't see the British economy as this global imperialist system, which is what it is, and think that Britain should and can return to this earlier form of sovereign capitalism that is a bit of a fantasy in reality, or at least is a sort of distorted version of what used to exist in the past. It's a very much a petty bourgeois movement. It's very much a movement of the disenchanted petty bourgeois conservatives, UKIP, that is. There's all kinds of other people who support Brexit as well, but Nigel Farage's ability to connect with the disillusioned petty bourgeois conservative voter and a layer of disillusioned, more working class former Labour voters gave him a degree of popularity that he didn't was kind of unprecedented in British electoral terms. Now, the left in Britain is doing its usual thing of laughing, saying that one of their great enemies has been slain. And of course, they don't see the danger, which is that if they're doing this to Nigel Farage, who, although he has tweaked the nose of the political establishment and in their minds, and their rather petty and stupid minds, which I'll talk more about in a moment, he is responsible for the Brexit process that has gone on and the Brexit election of 2019. So there is clearly many exist in the state machine, security services, and in the wider, again using Lenin's terminology, financial oligarchy in the City of London, who are, quite frankly, incredibly angry with Farage, as they are with Boris Johnson. Again, another man who never meant in a million years to challenge the fundamentals of British capitalism, but he ended up straying into that territory more by accident than the design. And if they can do this to Farage, and remember, as I pointed out on Twitter, they started off by doing this to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks over a decade ago, withdrawing all their ability to receive financial support. And they've been escalating with this, and of course, this is now a key method of control for the ruling class. The idea of losing all access to your financial services that you need to use to actually get by on a day-to-day basis, that's quite terrifying for many people. And it should be something that should be roundly rejected and opposed, even if it's being done to fascists. And Farage isn't a fascist. I don't care what any whinging Trotskyite says. He's a fairly run-of-the-mill British conservative who would have been easily at home in the Conservative Party up until probably the middle of the 1980s, or maybe slightly later. So this idea that the removal of Farage's access to banking services should be celebrated is very, very foolish. And it just shows how angry and enraged and petty the people who run the state machine and, of course, the financial services industry in this country can be, in that they're even going to go after someone like Farage. It's the same story with Trump. Trump never meant in a million years to challenge the fundamentals of American capitalism, and in office he largely didn't. But the fact that he was prepared to talk about making an accommodation with the Russians, the fact that he was prepared to talk about doing some sort of deal with China, trying to avoid war, even though, of course, he engaged in some fairly terrible warmongering of his own. My point is, the slightest deviation from the norm, from the absolutely rigid system of control that has been imposed upon bourgeois politics by the ruling class since the end of the Soviet Union, is making it so incredibly repressive that even people like Trump and Farage and minor irritants to the ruling class, like this guy who runs the Wings Over Scotland Twitter account, even they get in the way and unintentionally make enemies in powerful places. because what they all have in common, at least what Trump and Farage have in common, is the belief that they should be able to use the state machine to make some kind of change. Whereas, of course, the entire state machine, certainly since the crash of 2008 in the imperialist countries, is dedicated only to maintenance of the status quo in a very rigid way. They cannot allow any deviation, because any deviation will lead to, in their minds, and they're probably quite right about this, disruption and collapse. The people who run the state machine in the United States and Britain and elsewhere are absolutely desperate to try and unwind what has been done over the last 7 to 8 years. In their minds, it is the Brexit process, it's Trump, it's the unleashing of populism, which has caused all this instability, which has caused them all these problems. And that's why they're doing things like trying to lawfare Trump out of running for president again. That's why they're cancelling Farage's bank accounts. And we should look at this as an escalation from the ruling class and a move towards more and more instability. Because normally, before 2015, the ruling class could take people like Farage when they didn't really matter, or when they didn't really matter as much. They might even encourage, as they did, Trump to run for the presidency because they never thought he'd get anywhere near it. But what has happened is, since that, what you would call the populist period, 2015 to, broadly speaking, 2017, 18, and then it was rolled up, what that's exposed is just how little change is possible inside the system, even when it's pro-capitalists who are the people trying to make the change. We saw this also with the ending of the career of Silvio Berlusconi in 2011, when he was dismissed in what was basically a palace coup. So we should be very wary. In fact, we must reject what has been done to people like Farage with the removal of his bank accounts, because it sets very dangerous precedents, and we do not want to make the ruling class's job easier. But we must observe this for what it is, which is, it's a petty act, but it's also an act of intimidation towards anybody else who might think of trying to make political capital out of what is going to be becoming an even bigger and greater crisis as times go on. So this is something that we need to be aware of. It's something that we need to be making sure that we roundly reject, and we explain to people our reasoning for doing so, because we cannot allow a situation where we have the left cheering on this cancellation of people's bank accounts, the attempt to deny them the ability to make ends meet, even for a character like Farage, or even for people worse than him. Celebrating that is stupid. It is done by people who are running on bitterness and emotion. And this, if you are in that mindset of just running on venting and rage and emotion, and of course you are then very malleable and subject to manipulation by the ruling class's propaganda machine, because you are obeying them in chasing after their demon of the minute. And I would say that this is something that needs to be rejected by everybody. And also, it reminds me again that Brexit was very much the right move, because look how much it has enraged and embittered and disadvantaged the ruling class and exposed the fragility of their system. Brexit in itself, of course, holds no solutions, but it is an important stage in unpicking the mechanisms of control that the ruling class have available to them, and in damaging their ability to run the imperialist system as they did prior to Britain exiting the EU in 2020. So again, this is something which exposes many left failures, and it's something we need to raise our voices about in opposing, no matter who it happens to. So that's the reason why I started early, and the reason why I wanted to jump on, just to offer some words on that. Just going to type a welcome message in the chat. And then I'm going to get on to, well, connected to Brexit, because tonight we're looking at the European Union and all the foolishness that it engages in, asking the question, well, why does it do that? Why does the EU engage in what some people are looking at this, whose word I respect and other issues? There is a delusion amongst many people of a more liberal disposition that the EU was capable of some kind of strategic autonomy, especially in the post-Cold War era, and that it is this removal of that potential for autonomy in its decision making, of being able to act free of the influence of the United States, that this has been withdrawn or collapsed recently over the Russia-NATO war in Ukraine, and that this is unexplainable, or this is the result of just bad decision making on the part of some inadequate politicians such as Schultz or Macron or Meloni or Draghi before her. And what I want to make the case for tonight is that the EU never had strategic autonomy, that there were moments in its earlier history during the Cold War when it had a little bit more leeway, but that has eroded and eroded over the last 30 years to the point where all that the Russia-NATO war in Ukraine has really done is expose just how little autonomy this institution actually has, and just how much all of the countries of Europe are essentially an appendage of the US empire, not just Britain. And the British case is, of course, spectacular in its own ways, in its subservience to the United States, but we must explain that properly as well. I'm just going to pause here and drop this invite out there. Good evening to Irish Partisan, our comrade in Belarus, and good evening to Peter as well. So, beginning then with the case I'm going to be making. So, where did the EU come from? Where did the idea of the EU being strategically autonomous come from? Now, the idea, or the ideal, if you want to put it that way, behind the EU is, of course, one that has been played with by European bourgeois intellectuals going back over 100 years. The idea that they could just unify the continent of Europe under some sort of collaborative regime, then the wars in which so many had died and so much had been destroyed could have been prevented. Now, of course, as Lenin pointed out in as early as, I believe, 1919, a United States of Europe that was done on a capitalist basis could only be done in a reactionary way, in an imperialist way. And so it proved, because the birth of the idea of a unified Europe came at the same time as of course, the birth of NATO. And the two things run alongside each other. And it's no coincidence that they do. Because in order to, of course, solidify the hold of capitalism over Western Europe, the United States after World War II had to do some serious investing and had to endure the making of concessions to the domestic working classes of Europe. And what I mean by this is they had to do the Marshall Plan, which was not some kind of act of generosity. It was a strategic choice to invest in the recovery of French and Italian and West German capitalism. And in West Germany, of course, remember, a lot of this was built using the skills of the officialdom of the Third Reich, and not just the military people, but the bureaucracy as well. Men who were very much implicated in the Holocaust, who got away with it. And the Nuremberg trials might have hanged the most obvious criminals, but a lot of the less obvious but no less guilty men got away with it and had long and distinguished careers in West Germany and, of course, the early European Union, as it was the European Coal and Steel Community back then, later the European Economic Community. People like Walter Hallstein, who was a Nazi lawyer who became one of the early movers in the United Europe movement. And the ability of the American ruling class to pull together the remnants of the capitalist class in Europe, because remember, they didn't have a lot left, the capitalists, after World War II had finished. They were facing a Soviet Union which had an army 6 million strong, which had a gigantic industrial capacity, which was sitting across half of Europe. And in half of Europe, revolutionary processes started to get underway, which the Soviet Union, in the narrative presented by British and American propagandists, the Soviet Union just imposed all those governments in Eastern and Central Europe. This is very much not the case. What happened was the destruction of the old states which had either been controlled by the Nazis or aligned with the Nazis in Central and Eastern Europe, and the weakening of the ruling classes of places like Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, and of course in Yugoslavia you got a different revolutionary process underway, and in Albania as well. But this move to what was called the people's democracies was influenced heavily by not the actions of the Red Army as such, but by the actions of the proletariat and peasantry in these countries, who were actually able to form People's Front governments after World War II, exploiting the weakness and the chaos in the ruling classes of these countries to push forward with, at first, reform plans and then more revolutionary processes by unifying peasant parties, communist parties and social democratic parties into these People's Front governments, where either these parties merged into one, as it did with the Socialist Unity Party in the DDR, East Germany, or they formed People's Front governments, as they did in several other of the Eastern European countries. So the question to deal with here is, why was the US interested in rebuilding Europe and then having it unified? Well, out of a matter of necessity. The US ruling class realized that they needed Europe to not only survive but thrive, and that to do that they needed to rebuild it and also make concessions to the working class. And that's why they invested so much through the Marshall Plan. That's why they engaged in the business of reconstruction, and it's why they essentially gave the green light to Germany, West Germany, France, Italy, and of course Britain to do social democratic reform programs. And those reform programs, of course, were designed to take the sting out of a revolutionary potential that had grown within the working classes of Western Europe and Britain. And the period of reform did its job. It took the sting out of those potentially revolutionary moments, but also it helped to bring about the long-term corrosion and ultimate destruction of the communist parties in Western Europe and Britain. And I've covered that extensively elsewhere, so I won't exhaustively go over it again. But what it fostered was a delusional belief in all of the communist parties in Europe that reform could be achieved to the point where people's democracies would emerge in France and Italy and Britain. Now, of course, this was delusional because the reason why the people's democracies were able to emerge and then grow into socialist systems in Eastern Europe was because the ruling class and the state had been, first of all, much weaker than the ruling class and the state is in a place like Britain anyway, but also that the state, the old state, had been effectively destroyed in the war, either destroyed by the Nazis or the collaborationist states that existed in places like Romania were destroyed in the war against the Red Army and the Soviet Union. So you can't compare these situations where you have the French state and even the Italian state, which managed to reconstitute themselves on a fairly strong basis with the backing of US imperialism fairly quickly after World War II, even with the presence of strong communist parties, and the British state, which escaped the most devastating aspects of destruction in World War II, even though it came out of World War II very weakened. So you can't compare that with Czechoslovakia or Poland. It's not the same. The ruling class in Britain is much, much stronger, which is why the attempt by the Communist Party of Great Britain in its 1951 programme, the British Road to Socialism, to say that they could secure some kind of transition to people's democracy via the methods of bourgeois parliamentarism, this was so misguided and led to so many bad decisions and led to revolutionary opportunities being missed, because once you start down the road of a poor decision based on an opportunist method, well, you only decline and decline, as the Communist Party of Great Britain did, as the French communists did, as the Italian communists did, until eventually in the 80s you get to the point where liquidationism comes around. I give all that as the foreground because to understand why Europe is, and more specifically the ruling classes of Europe, are wholly owned and controlled in the United States, you have to start here in that post-war period. Now, in the period running up to the 80s, of course, you got people like de Gaulle and people like Willy Brandt in the Federal Republic of Germany, who did exercise a modicum of autonomy from the United States. They did do some things which US imperialism had to swallow, because they needed those countries to stay on side and they needed to have them firmly in their camp. But they never left the camp of US imperialism. That's the point. And US imperialism, when West German manufacturing started to endanger its position as the dominant manufacturing power in the world, of course, then stuck a great bill onto the Germans by making the German ruling class pay for the protection of the US forces stationed in Germany. So from the early 1970s, in order to shed themselves of the bill, the US ruling class basically presented a bill to the Germans and say, well, we're protecting you from the Soviet Union, therefore you better pay us. And this was all part of course, the dollar becoming the reserve currency of the world, which is very well documented in the book by Michael Hudson on this subject. He's written extensively on it. I've said before, I have a number of disagreements with Hudson's perspectives on imperialism, but his work on this history of the emergence of the dollar as the international reserve currency is very, very much worth reading. I would encourage anybody to read the book Super Imperialism. A lot of really fascinating historical details in there. So, and I'm going to do some hellos. We got Kai in Massachusetts. Hello. Hello to Jerry Jacobs. Hello to 1916 Easter Rising. Great title. And Jerry, I'm glad you found the bit on Brexit useful. And so, the point to emphasize is that from the very beginning, the EU and NATO were hooked together as a co-project of US imperialism. The idea that the EU, in any of its forms, be it the coal and steel community, the European Economic Community, or any of its other titles, has been something which has been against the interests of US imperialism is a myth. US imperialism wanted a united Europe, and it wanted a united Europe that would dance to its tune, economically speaking, and it's always been able to crack the whip and get them to do so, because the ruling classes of Europe emerging from World War II were very weak, as I've already said. They needed the backing of US imperialism to re-establish themselves in the colonial world, which they traditionally dominated, in a very direct sense, when you got the US backing the war of the Dutch in Indonesia and the war of the French in Vietnam. And of course, then you get the collapse of the British Empire, or at least the British Empire in its land-based form in the 50s and 60s, after the last attempt of the British ruling class to assert themselves as an independent imperialist power in Suez in 1956, which ends in the run on the pound being instigated by Eisenhower and the British government having to humiliatingly implode, basically. And it was the end of Anthony Eden's political career. And from that point onwards, the British ruling class knew that they could only survive as an imperialist power with the benefit of the protection of US imperialism. And from that point onwards, they stopped trying to act purely independently, and they acted in concert with the US wherever they needed to, and were always ready to back up the US wherever they needed to. And the only reason they didn't enter the Vietnam War was because Wilson, at that time, knew very well it would be the end of him politically had he done so. There would have been a revolt of enormous proportions, and in the end he decided it wasn't worth it. And by the time we get to the Tories getting back in again in 1970, he also decided that it wasn't worth it because the US was already looking for a way out. So the times when Britain breaks away from the US are very, very little. And the same is true of the Europeans as well. So by the time we get to the end of the Cold War, there's this new wave of what I will call liberal left hysteria breaks out, that they become convinced, these largely academic type people, some politicians like Michael Heseltine in Britain, they become convinced that there is a moment now where the hegemony of the US over Europe can be undone. But of course, this is not the case. As you will have heard if you've listened back to the interviews I've done in the past with people like Kit Clarenberg, the attempt by the Europeans to assert themselves in security matters after the end of the Cold War came in the Balkans in the early 90s, where the US was, well, funneling money and guns to almost everybody in that conflict, just as long as the socialist system got destroyed. But the main beneficiaries, shall we say, of their munificence were the Bosnian Muslims headed by Alija Izetbegović. And Izetbegović was in talks sponsored by the Europeans in the early 90s and was looking like he was going to sign a deal. And the US says, don't sign it, hold out, we'll give you everything you need to win. And the US did for a while, but then when the US decided that, well, enough was enough, their point had been made to the Europeans that there could be no peace without the US being in charge of it, they pulled the plug on Izetbegović, and the Bosnians ended up with a much worse deal than they would have got in 1993. So 2 years, tens of thousands of dead later, and there's a worse deal than was on the table in 93. All thanks to Izetbegović being a wretched comprador piece of shit, and the US being engaged in the kind of manipulative games so it could show the Europeans that they couldn't function in the realm of security and diplomacy without the US being on side. Because the sheer power and weight of US imperialism overshadows and can overpower any of the other power blocks in the early 1990s. The European Union was reminded that it basically had to fall into line behind the US, as it did throughout the 1990s. When we get to the Kosovo War a few years later in 1999, the European Union is largely on board with it. The Germans are on board with it, enthusiastically so. The French are on board with it under Chirac. And this is a war led by US imperialism and the British. And the Europeans all fall into line and all take part in the final dismembering of Yugoslavia and the destruction of that state and the creation of this gangster state protectorate that is run by the US and the British, primarily in the form of Kosovo. So that's the 1990s. So when there was meant to be this outbreak of strategic autonomy of the EU, you get the opposite. You get a reaffirmation of US power over the EU. You get a reaffirmation of that again in the early 1990s when, of course, the former people's democracies, having gone through the counter-revolutionary process of 89 to 91, all joined the EU, and these countries are even more hooked in to the US imperialist system because their comprador ruling classes and the political and military personnel who make up their political and military structures, or the hierarchy of them at least, these are all people who owe their careers to the US empire. If you look at the kind of people who run the Baltic states or run Bulgaria, these are all people who were trained in US universities a lot of the time. They all did work in the Cold War with US NGOs. They're all complete creatures of the US political system in the Cold War. So they get transplanted back into their countries of origin back in the 90s. And of course, they are phenomenally hostile to, well, the Russians for a start, a lot of them are. And they're very much rabidly pro-US imperialism. And so the entry of these countries into the EU did nothing for the so-called strategic autonomy of the EU. What it did was, of course, it further affirmed the power of the US imperialists over that particular bloc. So everything that gets done from the 1990s onwards, including, of course, not just the preservation of NATO, but its extension, is about, in part, the US retaining its hold over the European nations, particularly the Germans. And the delusions of certain German politicians, including Schröder and maybe Merkel to an extent, that they were going to get some new autonomy for Germany. Germany was going to play a more independent role. Well, none of them had the wherewithal to actually carry that out. Schroeder tried to an extent, then his project collapsed, and Merkel just bounced back between trying to assert bits of strategic autonomy and then having to fall back into line with the US again. Now, the question is, of course, why has the US retained this control? Part of it is, of course, the political developments of the 90s, the entry of the comprador regimes in Eastern and Central Europe. But there is also an economic foundation to this, and it is to that I will turn to now. So, what I'm pulling up on the screen now is, of course, everybody's favorite thing. It's a chart, and this is a chart taken from the most recent report available on the US government's Bureau of Economic Affairs website, and you can see there on the chart, this is about US foreign direct investment overseas. Now, the bars on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see there that the amount of direct investment in Europe is phenomenally high. It's over $3 trillion in 2021, higher than 2020. And in actual fact, that figure has been going up year on year ever since the 1990s started. So the amount of US direct investment in the European Union, the area known as the European Union, has been going up and up and up for many, many years. And if you look on the other side of the graphs, on the right-hand side there, you can see that the foreign investment in the United States from Europe has been climbing and climbing as well. And so this is a big part of why the US retains so much political and economic control of the European nations, of the European Union as a whole. This is a gigantic amount of foreign direct investment that comes into Europe. Now, inside the Europe figures there is, of course, also included the British economy as well. So it's has to be taken into consideration there, because a huge part of that chunk of investment is coming into Britain. Now, a lot of this comes into financial services inside the UK, but also it goes into commercial and manufacturing enterprises in Germany, in Italy, and France. So these figures here, this is a huge part of the reason why it is that the US has the amount of control that it does. When you're moving this much capital into Europe, and then there's this much capital coming out of Europe into the US again every single year, that is a hugely powerful position. And of course, bear in mind on top of this, you also have the fact that through NATO, the United States has all these bases in Europe, in Germany and Italy and Spain and Portugal, and all their bases, of course, in Central and Eastern Europe. You put these two things together, the amount of direct investment the US does in Europe, the amount of direct investment that goes back, you get the enormous security apparatus that the US dominates in Europe, and you start to see the picture as to why the European Union, and the Germans in particular, because without the Germans there is no European Union, why it is the case that the US gets its way. Why is Scholz cutting off Russian energy, even though German industry needs that Russian energy to thrive? So let's just compare this with Chinese foreign direct investment in Europe, because one of the arguments going on at the moment, and I'll just change the graph there, is that, well, why are the Germans and others risking even talking about cutting off the Chinese? Well, it's because that even though, and as we'll see from the next chart coming up, the trade with China is enormously important for Germany and other nations, and it's growing in terms of its power, the actual amount of investment and trade that the Chinese engage in Europe is still nowhere near as much, and has nowhere near the same economic power as the trade done by the United States does, and the investment done by the United States does. So if you look at the FDI from China there, you can see that it peaks in 2016 and then goes downhill and there's a slight rally in 2021. Now, look at the patterns here. We've got the US foreign direct investment in Europe going up and up and up, and the Chinese slowly going down, slightly rallying. The latest figures for 2022 might show a slight change there, but it's still not on the same level of economic dominance that the United States has. Now, the reason why there's a row going on in the German ruling class at the moment, though, is because China is very important when it comes to things like trade and imports, etc. So let's just switch this over to, this is the ranking of Germany's foreign trade partners. And if you turn your attention to that, you can see there why the German ruling class are conflicted over the way forward. Because in terms of German exports, the United States remains, by quite some distance, the number one export destination. China's in there too at number 4, and of course most of the rest of the export destinations are other European nations. But that's a hugely important market for the German ruling class, and they don't want to lose it. Now, you look on the other side there, the column on the right-hand side, and you can see that, of course, in terms of imports, China is far in the lead, slightly ahead of the Netherlands, who are ahead of the United States. Now, of course, this creates a problem for the German ruling class in that their two primary trading partners are at odds with each other. And the ability of the German ruling class to balance between their old partner slash occupier, which is what the US does, it occupies Germany, and their newly emerging import partner in China, you get the source of the conflict within the German ruling circles there, in that they need both. They need that huge export market in the United States for German cars and German technology, but they also need China to be the source of a lot of their imports. Now, what does China import into Germany? China imports an awful lot of parts for cars and other pieces of German tech that get made in China, get brought over into Germany. And so what a lot of German manufacturing is now is it's putting together a series of pieces that are manufactured in China, and then the final finishing touches to the finished product, such as a car, are done in Germany, but all the individual parts are made in China. So where it's actually made is an open question. It's constructed in Germany, but it's made in China. So without that access to the huge manufacturing capacity of the Chinese, and then the Germans are going to have their industry severely damaged, as it's already been damaged by the Americans effectively cutting them off from Russian energy. But what we're dealing with here is the contradictions of capitalism and the contradictions of imperialism playing themselves out inside Europe. Now, as I said, Europe is completely dominated by US imperialism. As you can see from the fact that they've been investing more and more and more over time in Europe, as they've been trying to essentially push out the competition from China, because they know very well that the competition with China is not going well in terms of their ability to muscle out the Chinese in places like Africa and the various nations there that the Chinese are building partnerships with, and of course in Central Asia, where they're in a competition with both the Russians and the Chinese for influence. But they risk, of course, losing that fight. And so what do? Well, they need to secure their long-term bases. And their longest-term area of domination is Europe itself, with all, of course, the legacies of the colonial period at its disposal. And another reason why, of course, the European nations are so dependent upon the United States is that these days the United States is the only country in the capitalist bloc. It is the leader of this capitalist bloc, and they are the only nation within it with the military power to project force anywhere in the world. And so for a nation like France, which is so dependent upon the continued exploitation of their old African colonies, I'll come in future episodes to talk about the CFR franc area and how the French retained control of the economies of Western Africa for over 60 years after these nations attained nominal independence. So to retain that power over Western African nations, though, the French ultimately need the power of the gun. Remember Mao's old phrase, all political power grows out of the barrel of a gun? Well, very true in this case as well. Ultimately, they need to be able to project power into these countries in order to protect their investments. Now, the French got driven out in the end of Mali and are being driven out of Burkina Faso and other areas. And they're going to want to try and grab hold of and keep hold of those places. But they can't do it militarily, as the war in Ukraine has cruelly exposed. The Europeans have very small armies that aren't built for the kind of long-term brutal campaigns that the Russia war is exposing, that they are not capable of waging such a war. And they're barely even capable of keeping a military presence in the African nations anymore. And so to enforce not just French domination of West Africa, but European domination of the economies of both northern and sub-Saharan Africa, they need US military power to enforce these colossally unequal terms of trade with countries like Kenya, with countries like Tanzania and others who were subjected to the undiluted whims of the American imperialist bloc in the 1990s and 2000s. Now these countries are starting to have a choice over who they do business with, and that choice largely involves the Chinese. The Americans and the Europeans in particular are freaking out about their influence within these countries, and they're ever more dependent upon US imperialism militarily to be able to enforce their power in these economic transactions. So this, again, is why the European Union, the European nations, are completely subsumed under the power of US imperialism. So let's look at another graph now. This is another graphic coming up. I'm just going to pull this up here. And this is foreign direct investment in Britain. Just to give you an indication of the main investors inside Britain. Now, what you are looking at here is really a chart as to who's rinsing money through the British Stock Exchange and the British banking system. So you see that the US is by far the leader there. The next one along is the Netherlands, followed by Luxembourg, Belgium. Now, UK offshore islands refers to places like the British Cayman Islands. So money coming from there gets rinsed through the City of London and off somewhere else. And they often invest in banking and commercial services in the City of London area and the wider London area. Then you get Japan, Germany, and France. So again, a completely dominant position for US imperialism there, and another reason why, of course, Britain remains the junior partner to US imperialism. So that's just an indication as to what the situation is in Britain. And it's not a particularly favourable one. So this is the picture as to why you get such pathetic and useless German leaders, such as Olaf Scholz, why you get Macron, who says one thing one day and a completely contradictory thing the next day. Because these people, Macron especially, I don't know about Scholz, the man doesn't strike me as being particularly intelligent. They know very well that the cutting off of relationships with Russia is damaging. They know very well that if they are forced to cut off their trading relationship with the Chinese, this is especially true of the Germans, that will be enormously damaging. But they can't get out of this stranglehold that US imperialism has over them, because it has had this stranglehold since 1945. That is a long time to have your nations subsumed under the power structure of an imperialist overlord, basically. Now, we need to emphasize here that what the US did is, post-1945, they are able to essentially unite all these remaining capitalist countries behind it in a unified imperialist bloc, which, although they have disputes from time to time, these are largely resolved in the favor of the United States over time, as is evidenced by the fact that when it came to competition from German industry, the US forced the new agreement on paying for their forces in West Germany, on the Germans at the time. And then when it came to competition from the Japanese in the 1980s, they forced the Plaza Accords on the Japanese government, and also then carried out several actions doing basically corporate raiding on the Japanese microprocessor industry, and train wrecked the Japanese economy by the early 1990s. So again, US so-called allies, in reality vassals, destroying their own economic progress because the US ordered them to. That's nothing new. It's nothing new at all. It's been going on since at least the 1970s. So Schultz and Macron and the others, and Meloni in Italy, they're just the particularly weak and useless versions of European leaders who've done this many times before. And when people say, oh, where is de Gaulle these days? Where is Willy Brandt? Bear in mind this. De Gaulle only had the strategic autonomy that he did, which was pretty limited in reality. He went along with the US on most things. He disagreed with them on small matters, really, and remained firmly within the US imperialist bloc. The idea that de Gaulle's France was ploughing some wholly independent furrow is incorrect. It is a myth. It's mythology built up by the Gaullists themselves. The last French president to try any remote amount of autonomy from the United States was Chirac, and that completely collapsed within a few years, and he was replaced by an endless stream of salivating fools who prostrate themselves before the feet of US imperialism. De Gaulle was just the last to be able to successfully periodically assert French sovereignty against US overlordship. Brandt did a few things that the US didn't approve of, but always he was firmly within the US camp. And back when the Soviet Union existed, as I said earlier, they were forced to give their European vassals a little bit more autonomy. That's all gone now. Not only is the capitalism of France and Germany and Italy and the weaker countries like Spain and Greece much, much diminished since the 1960s and 70s. But of course, as that has diminished, the political establishment has rotted along with it. And so you get these weak, useless, feckless leaders who are completely incapable of defying the United States, because if the United States chooses to exert economic pressure on them, then those economies will fall to pieces, because the US controls all the levers of the world imperialist system into which all of these countries are integrated. So I will pause there for questions and comments. Thank you to Austin. Great work. Much appreciated. Well, glad you're watching. Kai S. says, as a recovering reactionary newly interested in Marxism, I appreciate your analysis of geopolitics. Well, thank you for tuning in, Kai. I hope you're getting something out of it. Be sure to join us for the study of the Stalin work, Anarchism or Socialism, on Saturday. Peter, it says that he's an ex-trot who got very disillusioned, especially with left identity politics. It's easy to drift into reactionary thought. CPGB ML and Marx Engels Lenin Institute has been the shot in the arm I've needed for years. Well, glad to be of assistance, Peter. And just to pick up on your point there, yes, the craziness of the identity politics obsessed left and all of the wild garbage that they indulge in, Malthusianism over the climate change narrative, and I'll come to climate change in future programs to express fully my views on that, but needless to say, they do not coincide with the British left or the American left. All the nonsense about gender ideology and the bizarre and frankly perverted version of humanity that the left believes in, well, all of that can make a person just assume that, well, the left is this nightmare, so I'm going to throw my hat in with the reactionaries, because at a time of political stagnation and collapse, well, people become pessimistic and disillusioned and drift easily into just outright reactionary thought, because if you're faced with the choice of a left which seems anti-human and crazy, and a right that at least opposes the things that you hate, well, in a negative political situation, a lot of people just end up drifting into agreeing with the right because the right says that they oppose the things that these people rightly find disgusting in the left. But of course, the political right is also part of a capitalist system which generates all the foul rottenness that the left expresses. And the right, people like Ted Cruz in the United States and the various Conservative Party right-wingers here, are all rabidly enthusiastic capitalists and, of course, enthusiastic imperialists. So they help create and recreate all the things that they say they oppose. So it's a futile thing to get involved with, but of course people fall into it through pessimism and despair. Hello to Zuleika, and Jerry asks, is this investing is a parasitic leeching thing? It can be, but it's also that the US is investing in, well, partly with this huge amount of capital that comes into Europe, it's moved through Europe and into other enterprises elsewhere. Partly it's investment in industry and financial services, which is a big thing for all of the European countries, all being imperialist countries. They need that capital to come in and be invested in their financial services industry. And of course, that gives the US a lot of leverage. So yes, part of it is parasitic, part of it is investment in certain industries which are very important to the US imperialist bloc. And it gives the US an awful lot of power. Slava says, the US is always number one in all of the negative influence lists. Never heard states leading in something good or beneficial for humanity. Well, yes, number one in people imprisoned in the world and drug addiction, I think. And Britain not far behind. HM asks, where did the degrowth narrative come from? Who benefits? That's an interesting question. I could spend an hour talking about degrowth, but just in brief, it comes from a certain set of bourgeois ideas that are very, very old. You can argue that degrowth was present in the theories of Malthus, Thomas Malthus, who Marx famously debunked in the 19th century. The idea that everything was growing too much, the population was growing too much, we wouldn't have enough resources to feed all these teeming masses of humanity, and therefore we needed to actually cut down on the population. That's part of it. But modern degrowth, that comes really at a time of capitalist crisis in the early 70s. It's associated with things like the Club of Rome, if you look that up. I'll talk more about them in future episodes. And it comes about in the middle of the early 70s capitalist crisis, and it comes about through this idea of we're going to have a zero growth economy. And that's a reflection of, that's a bourgeois intelligentsia response to the crisis of the early 70s. And they latched onto that with the idea that the Earth itself was collapsing. Now, at the time, they said it was all about global cooling, not global warming. And so this happens around about the same time as you get the first Earth Day held and various other bourgeois freakouts about environmental collapse, end of the world stuff. Now, a lot of this has its roots within capitalist crisis because the bourgeois intelligentsia can't and won't see a way out other than more capitalism. If capitalism looks like it's in danger and no alternative seems available to them, they'll just start freaking out and proclaiming it's going to be the end of the fucking world. So that's where it comes from. The modern version of sort of degrowth ideas, that comes from the early 70s period. And it's developed and developed ever since then. And it's no coincidence that it's reached hysterical levels since the 2000s, when the capitalist crisis in the West has accelerated again. And all of the major growth economies are in the East, like in China, for instance, or the re-emergence of the Russian state as something which is truly powerful. So it's always a reflection of underlying capitalist crises that the bourgeois intelligentsia rediscovers it forms of Malthusian thought, starts preaching end of the world stuff, and at root it's all about trying to get the working class to accept progressively worse terms and conditions, because essentially they'll then hold an imaginary gun to your head and say it's either a worse life or the end of the world, things like that. This is all hysteria generated by the difficulties of capitalism itself and awful state that the imperialist countries' economies are in. Panicking regime absurdly called Biden seems to have gone into full-blown psychopath mode, says Peter. Yep. Glad you like the reply about the reactionary temptation, Peter. It's in future episodes I'll be doing stuff on like maintaining yourself as a communist in challenging times. Because the temptation to fall back either into reactionary thought or just other forms of bourgeois thought, it's always there because the power of the bourgeoisie is such that their ideology permeates and dominates everything, from the stuff on your television to the advertisements you see in the paper to social interactions all around you. Capitalist bourgeois ideology is everywhere, and so falling back into it again is something which is a constant risk, and we need to be honest about that and be aware of it and understand how we can stop ourselves falling prey to it. Careful study of the Marxist canon, the Marxist tradition, is the best way to avoid that, as is, of course, being a member of a party, regularly discussing with comrades and things like that. But I'll say more about all of those things on future episodes. You mean you don't trust Billy Boy Gates and his chums on their thoughts about climate change? Strangely enough, DE, no, I don't. As I said, more on that in future episodes. Thoughts on the whereabouts of Surovikin, asks President Jesus. Now, this is a story that's been floating around. The Ukrainians were bigging it up. The idea that Surovikin had been arrested following the Prigozhin events. I don't really believe that at the moment. I mean, Surovikin did a very early video denouncing Prigozhin. It's been said by his daughter, apparently, that he's at work in the MOD and the Russians feel no need to suddenly produce him. So I don't think that he's been arrested until I see definitive proof that he has been. I'm going to assume this is a Ukrainian and British-American propaganda drive, basically. Paul Charo. Hi Alex, what do you think of Vanessa Beeley's theory that Prigozhin antics were an attempt to distract while the Russians and the Syrian armed forces started to move their troops into American and Al-Qaeda areas of Syria with major attacks carried out, not seen in years? Mind you, I may have mistaken something about her exact analysis. Well, I would say that I don't know why the Russians and Syrians would need such an elaborate distraction to carry out work in Syria when the US isn't really capable of resisting them anyway. I haven't read, I should say, I haven't read the Vanessa Beeley article that you're referring to, so it could be that she has some arguments in there that are more compelling, but given the way you've described it, I just don't see that being the picture. There's a lot of people coming up with all kinds of theories about how it was this kind of psyop, how it was a great trick. Look, as I said on Saturday, when I started doing these live streams in response to the Prigozhin thing, look, you need to face the reality that these things will happen. The Russian MOD and the Russian government left themselves with a big problem to deal with when it came to Wagner and Prigozhin himself. That was a big problem that they needed to resolve, and now they've managed to actually resolve it, it looks like. But they left themselves with an issue that ultimately exploded in their faces, and Putin dealt with it about as well as you could possibly expect. The bloodshed was kept to a minimum. All of Russian society united behind him and his government, and Prigozhin was forced to scuttle out of the country with his tail between his legs, and Wagner's being broken up. So I don't buy this 10-dimensional chess thing. I think a lot of people don't want to admit that what happened was a manifestation of a problem which the Russian government's messy policy when it came to Wagner helped cause. But I will read the Vanessa Beeley article and comment further if there's more in there that I haven't seen yet. So, but to conclude on Paul's point, I hope the Russian and Syrian attacks on the Al-Qaeda strongholds are successful, and that these wretched scumbags who work for the American imperialists are all pushed out of Syria. Kai S. says, it's a conversation with Peter. Gender ideology and acceptance of all sexual aberration did help keep me attached to reactionary thought. I'm glad to know that not all on the left support it. No, I mean, Kai, in response to your question or comment there, I'll come in future to the question of the so-called sexual revolution and what that ultimately did. But to summarize in a sentence, it's when you get stuff like that, so-called sexual revolution, in the context of the capitalist mode of production still being in existence, what it's going to do is, along with some positive elements of it, it's going to recreate a lot of negative elements, such as the continued exploitation of women in particular. And because it's exploding something into a pre-existing set of bourgeois property relations that are oppressive and are exploitative. And so therefore you suddenly allow and sort of anything goes sexual morality, and you're going to get an awful lot of exploitative and negative consequences that come out of that, as we now see. Nevertheless, it was my Christian conviction that led me to reject liberalism, rightist nationalism, and embrace Marxist egalitarianism. Well, interesting journey you've had there, my friend. Feel free to talk more about it. Slava asks, have you addressed the Frankfurt School and critical theory and cultural Marxism? I did a podcast on cultural Marxism a few weeks ago. I may address it on this program if there's a demand to, but go back and listen to that one. It's in the archive, Slava. I will be returning to it in the future, though. Zuleika says, agreed, reading Lenin sometimes is like a hot bath for the brain, relaxing. Exactly the point. Go back if you're feeling at a point where you need to reset yourself, you're feeling run down, politically speaking. Reading Lenin, reading Stalin, reading Mao can be a great help. And also reading Marx and Engels themselves. What it can also do, along with sort of clarifying your ideas, reading some history from the great thinkers of the past can help you contextualize the things you're going through. If you're facing like these huge difficulties which seem insane and difficult to overcome, you can look back at Marx and Engels and Lenin and Stalin and Mao and others and find that they all faced similar circumstances and these were overcome. So being able to contextualize your situation by reading history and reading about how things were done in the past and reading about how the great leaders of the past addressed these questions or similar questions can really help you get over a political logjam, shall we say. So Peter says, reading Lenin on imperialism, the high stage of capitalism, again after many, many years, utterly brilliant. Paul says, thanks Alex, I appreciate it. I actually have agreed with your analysis early on as it's the only thing that makes sense. I saw Vanessa's analysis on a recent UK column programme. I didn't read an article, though she had clearly thought it out well in advance. Well, I'll check the article, Paul. Zuleika says, not many men write or speak compassionately or respectfully about women, but I find that Lenin does. When times get tough, the interview with Zetkin is reinvigorating. Yes, if you haven't read it, the interview between Lenin and Clara Zetkin is particularly illuminating. Yeah, so this is something she wrote in 1924, I believe just after Lenin died. So I'll just drop that in the chat there. Be sure to check that out. So, yes, to conclude the thought, or to conclude the program here, what we've been talking about tonight is why the US dominates Europe as much as it does. And it is my argument that it has done so to a greater or lesser degree since at least 1945, and that this domination has deepened and accelerated since 1991. The removal of the alternative system represented by the Soviet Union and the people's democracies only strengthened the US as the capitalist nations in Europe slowly weakened following the end of the Cold War. And so therefore you cannot be surprised that we find ourselves in a situation where the US dominates Europe in the way that it does. Even with the growth of trade with China, as you can see from the figures I've presented, it is nowhere near the amount of domination that the US actually has. And the ability of the US also to militarily dominate Europe should not be underestimated. It's not just a question of the raw power and force that they have at their disposal in Europe, even though that is substantial. It's what the effect of almost 80-year long occupation has done to places like Germany and Italy. It has produced generation after generation of politicians, bourgeois politicians, who are completely incapable of making independent decisions without reference to the United States. Now, I was asked a question by somebody on the Telegram group, I believe, earlier on, about what the role of people like Meloni is. And so I'll conclude by addressing that point as well. The point about Meloni is that, first of all, she's a fake and a fraud. You can see that by her cringing attitude towards the war. I'll call it the war on Ukraine, because it's a war that's being waged on Ukraine by their own ruling class and by the Americans. But Meloni was talked up by a lot of people who are, broadly speaking, on the right. There's a lot of people, I think the Duran guys fall into this category to a degree, who get excited about like right-wing conservative nationalism, and they're always let down by it, of course. Why? Because, like Meloni, they come in talking this big game, and Meloni talks a big game against Macron, against the EU, and then when she gets in, she completely capitulates to US imperialism. Why? Because ultimately, you can't be against the EU without being against US imperialism. And all of these ruling classes in Europe understand very well that they have no interest in going against US imperialism, that US imperialism is militantly opposed to a weakening of the EU. They're also opposed to the EU becoming in any way independent of it as well. So that was the game that the British always played for the Americans in Europe, to make sure that the EU remained a viable project, but always one that was very much tethered to US imperialism. So if Meloni actually went against the EU and tried to do an Italian exit from the EU, that would be a direct attack on the interests of US imperialism, though, because they don't want to see the EU broken up. They find it very useful that it exists, even though, of course, it has to be kept in its place. And it will be a hugely disruptive thing to the American system of power and control in Europe if any of the countries, particularly one which, even though it's been weakened over the years, is still a major power in Europe, the Italians, if they were to leave the EU, that would be a blow to the United States, which is why Meloni has cucked, basically, to use a crude term. It's why the AfD in Germany will also crumble, because even though they're prepared to rattle a cage about paying for so much economic development in Poland and rumble and grumble about the war in Ukraine, they're not going to defy US imperialism, not in a million years. These bourgeois right-wing parties are completely in hock to US imperialism. They are just an expression of the reactionary tendencies within these countries. Now, yes, they've picked up support from disillusioned working class people in Italy and Germany and places like that. But look at what happened with Marine Le Pen in France. Read the book or the works of people like Charles Develin, the scholar who's covered the Yellow Vests. His comments on Le Pen are very interesting, as are other French Marxists who've analysed Le Pen. She went from this sort of more traditionally fascist model in the 2000s, where she was putting forward ideas about heavy state intervention in the economy, to becoming basically a pale imitation of Macron, because she's a bourgeois politician fundamentally, albeit one that the bourgeoisie didn't want to openly acknowledge that they wanted anything to do with, and she absorbed the lessons of her defeats, that in order to get anywhere near power, she had to present a series of policies that were acceptable to the French bourgeoisie, which involves, of course, an accommodation with the European Union. She's no longer talking about a French exit from the EU. She's accepting NATO. She's accepting all kinds of other things that she used to denounce, and she's become a pale imitation of Macron. Same, Meloni did it in record time. The AfD will do the same thing. These are not political forces that are going to contest in any serious way the power of the American imperialists over Europe, or the power of the domestic ruling classes, who are, of course, organically tied to the Americans by 1,000 economic strands. So everybody who's getting excited about Meloni or Le Pen or the AfD, I can understand why people in political despair would turn to these forces that appear to be radical, that appear to be oppositionist, but they're not. They're never going to be. They're not capable of challenging imperialism and domestic capitalism in any serious way. The only forces that can do that will be the forces of the organized working class, informed by the Marxist-Leninist tradition. That is the only way you're going to be able to actually tackle them. And that is the only thing that really scares them. They might moan and piss and whine and lash out at people like, to end the show where I started, people like Farage and other reactionaries who get in the way from time to time, or people like Trump, who has displeased them, not through anything he did, but by merely, again, getting in the way somewhat. But really, fundamentally, what they really fear, above everything else, is the organized working class, be it the organized American worker, British worker, German worker, Italian worker, never mind the workers and peasants in the dominated countries that are subject to the cruelties of imperialism. The organized working class is the only force in any of these societies that can seriously threaten the rule of the bourgeoisie. No amount of right-wing populists or social democrats are going to be able to do it. The only way you're even going to get mild reform in this situation of stagnating and collapsing capitalism in Europe is if you're able to basically hold a gun to the head of the ruling class, and that gun is wielded by the working class. So I will conclude the show there for tonight. I will just pick up on the final few comments. Jerry, I'm glad you found it useful. President Jesus says Jackson Hinkle thought that Meloni was going to usher in the MAGA communist revolution. I don't know how he could possibly have reached that conclusion, President Jesus, to be honest. Meloni was swearing she'll put Italian people first, but then Zelensky visited. Yeah, well, Meloni is going to put the Italian capitalist class first, and only them first. And they're linked by 1,000 strands to American imperialism, so she'll do what she's told. The last European statesman who defied the West in the US was Milosevic. Correct. A revisionist, a deeply flawed man, politically speaking. But yeah, he did defy the West to a degree. And in the end, it was only because Yeltsin sold him out that the Yugoslavs lost that war against NATO. Remember, they were and could have held out for longer if Yeltsin hadn't done the dirty on him, basically. And if the Yugoslavs had managed to hold out in that war, certainly what was Yugoslavia would be a better place, and certainly the region and Europe may well have been a better place. Kai says, thank you for responding to my comments, Alex. I look forward to listening to you comment on the sexual revolution in the future. And inshallah, I will attend Saturday's talk. Well, it'll be on the website and on the YouTube page and on the Odyssey page if you can't. But until tomorrow, until we speak again, I will thank you all for coming along tonight. Thank you all for your comments in the chat. Responding to your comments and questions always makes these things a lot more engaging for me. It's why I'm doing these live streams rather than the podcasts, because the engagement with people raising questions and making points makes the whole thing a lot more of a learning process for both yourselves and me as well. So until tomorrow, I thank you all for watching and listening. You can find the audio version of this on the website.